Hello, this is Virtualis the Chess Noob, learning and having fun with chess. The Scotch Gambit is a rather tricky and clever line in the Scotch game, where white has some potential pretty good winning chances against black. So how do we, as a player with the black pieces against the Scotch Gambit, defend against it? Let's find out. So as a quick reminder, the Scotch game, of course, begins with e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, and then d4. Now, after the pawns trade, rather than going through the more typical main line where the knight captures a pawn back on d4, the bishop develops to c4 instead, so foregoing recapturing material. And there's an intrinsic logic here. You could potentially get a pretty quick attack on the opponent's f7 square, on the f7 pawn. So that makes potentially a lot of sense. Now, let's look at it from the black's perspective. In this position with black, there is probably only one good move at the beginner intermediate level. Now, before I talk about that one good move, I'll go through a couple of other moves which are very common and have their own problems. So traditionally, when I faced off against the Scotch Gambit, I played bishop to c5, defending, also adding defense to the d4 pawn, maybe long-term pressure here as well. But the problem here is the Haxo Gambit, which is where the opponent plays c3. And this is looking pretty bad, realistically, for black. They're looking at taking over the center with an attack on the bishop as well. If you capture back, they take that back potentially with additional development. So this is not good for black. And in fact, when you look at the Lead Chess Community database, from this position of sort of lower rated games, white has a win ratio over black by over 60%. So I do not recommend this line, this Haxo Gambit line. The other possibility, which is actually potentially okay, is the very spicy bishop to b4 with check, which is the London defense. Now, this defense actually does pretty well at master's levels, but it doesn't seem replicated at beginner intermediate games, at lower rated games. White has a substantial win advantage, not as much as a Haxo Gambit line, but still sort of well over 50%. And the most obvious defense here for white, but any number of white moves are good, is again c3. So if you take, they just block back and there's an attack on the bishop. So here again, it's playable, but I think it is probably one of the more tricky lines to play at the beginner intermediate level. Now, the best move here is something called the Du Bois-Reyti defense, which is knight to f6. In the evaluation here, I think chess.com for some reason calls it an open two knights Italian, and it certainly does remind you of that, and I suppose you could transpose to that, but it has got sort of its own theory. So this is the Du Bois-Reyti defense. And the reason why it's good is that at the moment, it's all just about equal. White only has two good moves in this position. If they don't play those two moves, it's automatically better for white in evaluation. The less common move would be where they just short castles. Now that's less common because that just looks like it's straight up hanging, and it is, and you can capture that. The opponent will most likely try to pin the knight to the king afterwards, but it's basically okay. So in that position, it's still basically okay. And just to show what I mean, so let's say you take, they try to pin, now you've got d5, and things are looking actually completely okay for black. Now, much more commonly, they'll play the advanced variation, which is where the pawn, let's move back a bit, yep, so where the pawn now moves forward, attacking the knight, and here is where it gets a little bit tricky, because again, there's only one really good move for black. It's not entirely obvious. It is again d5, counterattacking the bishop. Here, the white has only one good move, which is a little bit obscure, which is bishop to b5, trying to pin the knight to the king. Everything else, black develops a substantial advantage. So if we go back to where the Scotch Gambit begins. To remember, play the knight, knight f6, with the advanced variation, immediate d5. Now, you saw a queen move before. The queen move is what I actually did in this game. In the Chess Bootcamp Club, there was actually a little bit of discussion about this line a few weeks ago, and sort of it was raised by one of the much more higher rated players, and I just literally forgot about that. And I thought that maybe I could pin that pawn to the king, but as we will see, that was a mistake. +2 immediately, and this comes a little bit to the power of the Scotch Gambit. If black plays inaccurately, white often ends up with quite a good position. Let's have a quick look at the review now before we move on. So there we go. All the way up to top. I played quite accurately in this game, but you can see that was that error with the queen move, and then I compound error on error. Effectively, you know, completely lost for most of the game, but I did manage in the middle game find a trick of my own where I get the advantage back. Let's go back now to the analysis. So I thought I was actually being pretty clever here, but my opponent plays a really good move, which is short castles, moves the king out of the pin. At this point, I think I remember the d5 move, so I played it, but it doesn't work because pawn captures knight now comes with an attack on the queen, which means I don't have enough time to take the bishop. Effectively, I have lost my knight for a pawn. Not good. And you know, my opponent now is trying to rapidly consolidate, trade pieces down, rapidly developing. My queen's out, subject to an attack. So I'm just scrambling, trying to consolidate, try to develop my pieces, and maybe I could, maybe I could fight on. So let's see. They made a good move. So centralizing the rook, rook e1, that's still okay at the moment. So develop my bishop. I thought that would potentially come with a bit of tempo. Take, they capture back, but I thought that was good for me because that knight is now pinned to the rook. I now can short castles, semi-open file with my rook. So I thought this was still potentially pretty okay for me. I didn't think I was winning. I thought it was okay. Very good move, my opponent. So lining up a battery, I think potentially trying to force a queen trade. Here, I thought I'd be able to get rid of that knight because that knight means that this is now undefended. And here I was wondered, should I capture or should I, chase the queen away? I opted to actually not take because I wasn't very happy with the rook getting all the way into my territory. So Stockfish was unafraid. They suggested taking the bishop right away, but I decided to make that move. Now, here I thought was potentially okay. So that is still pinned. That is defended, but now the pawn is no longer under direct attack because it's defended. So I thought potentially I have a chance. And more than that, with the pawn moving forward, defending that square, I can now have a place to move my knight. And that knight, that could potentially go to c7, which is a very, very forky square. So I thought potentially I've got some counter play, some counter attack here. Opponent played bishop h4, and I think this was probably their idea here. And here I got an evil, evil plan. So I just saw that that pawn is now, of course, pinned to the king, which means that pawn is not defending the f3 square. So that is very important because if I could bring my knight here, so they'll probably see this forking idea. So that's in fact what I did. They'll see this forking idea. So it looks like they'll want to move probably their queen this turn. That's what I thought. They want to move their queen this turn, and then they'll say, look, that pawn is now no longer defended. So that looks like a hanging pawn. So let's take. But if they move the queen to e5, now the knight has a fork of the king and queen, and they may have forgotten that that pawn isn't defending that square because until they move the bishop, it wasn't pinned. So I cross my fingers and see what would happen, and they fell for the trap. So check, king forced to move, they lose their queen, and here I knew I was back in the game. Now, it's still a bit tricky because even though I've gotten a queen, they have 4 pieces and I only have 3. So that can be tricky because otherwise you'll think trade down, but then it'll be 3 pieces versus 2. And that increasingly can be a little bit difficult to play. So I've got my bishop back, and now there's a bit of shuffling, here I would do it with check. I'm trying to find opportunities to see whether or not I could capture a piece. Here, I threaten the rook. That was a very good move by my opponent, but now I can capture that pawn, which of course comes with tempo. They move their rook all the way here to prevent back rank mate. That makes sense. In this position, I opted to just whack the bishop because otherwise I'll be losing that pawn. And again, some shuffling, trying to find a way maybe to get another piece. And at this point, I decided probably the thing I needed to do was to try to get a pawn all the way to the 7th rank, because very often then you could at least, maybe get another queen, but at least you can often end up trading a piece for a pawn. And then it'll be 2 pieces versus 2 pieces where I have a queen, definitely winning. So every sort of move where I'm allowed to push the pawn, that's what I do. So obviously you don't lose the queen. Rook to support the pawn as well, forward. And here my opponent decides to, thinks that I have a next move, but here we go. That now forces a trade. And yep, and they make the wrong move. Captures, captures, captures. Endgame, queen versus rook. Queen's definitely winning, and my opponent opted to resign. Good game, GG. The big takeaway from this game is to not be scared of the Scotch Gambit. Develop your other knight and then counterattack with d5. I hope you found this video interesting, and thanks for watching.